And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Steve Tomasula, one of America's most innovative experimental novelists. Steve Tomasula is the author of the novels Ascension, The Book of Portraiture, Voss, An Opera in Flatland, an acclaimed novel of the biotech revolution, Talk, a new media novel, and In Oz. His short fiction has been published widely and is collected in Once Human Stories. He's also the editor of Conceptualisms, the anthology of prose, poetry, visual, found, and hybrid writing as a contemporary art. Steve is very recently Professor Emeritus of English at Notre Dame University. In a few weeks at the University of Chicago's Conference Center in Paris, Steve himself will be honored with a scholarly conference titled Steve Tomasula, The Art of Representation. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Scott, first of all, for that introduction. And I'm thrilled to be part of this celebration of Joe's work because, as my title says, I've been reading his work for 30 years or more, and rereading it in preparation for today. It occurred to me how it's all of a fabric, and I'm going to read his major work, his major books, as in that way, as this kind of, as I say in the lecture, a manifesto for what the novel can be today. So I'll just start with the year 1995, which is widely recognized as the watershed between the internet as a domain of scientists and its mainstream use. In the English department, where I was a grad student and whose faculty Joe would later join, there was a terminal room, a closet that had been recommissioned to hold a keyboard connected to the mainframe in the computer science building for those few of us who use this newfangled thing called email. Word processing on this terminal was possible, and an exciting leap forward, as anyone who's ever had to compose an error-free document on a typewriter could attest, but it required using dot commands. That is, if you wanted a paragraph break, you'd have to type its code, left arrow, \P, right arrow, at the spot where you wanted the paragraph to begin. Later, I'd graduated to my first PC, as they were called, to distinguish them from mainframes, the only other option, and the wonder of WYSIWYG. Or as Joe writes, I remember well the transition during my sophomore year from typewriter to computer using Microsoft Word 5.0, and part of what made it so memorable, Tabbi later wrote, was the awareness that these machines were not simply neutral objects. It was clear that the machine was writing on us, changing how we thought, and in retrospect, doing so faster than we realized. Soon after, while working on my first novel, my day job was as a writer in the satellite division of Zenith Electronics Corporations, and though this was a multinational electronics company, I believe I was the only one in it to occasionally work from home, excitedly watching the red lights blink on the 300 baud modem I was able to hardwire into my PC's motherboard. One LED for each bit of the 8-bit words it was sending, taking about 5 minutes for a 7-page document as the internet continued to trickle into our lives. And I only mention it now as a way to highlight how forward-thinking the writing of Joseph Tabbi was at the time. As his first book was being published, the number of web pages grew from about 10,000 to 100,000, rapidly swelling into first a river. The invention of JavaScript allowed scrolling and interactivity on web pages, then a raging river. Amazon, eBay, and Netscape came online, and then the Noachian flood that followed, a totalizing power that defies representation, as Tabbi described its overwhelming power and scale, a power and scale that is both terrifying and awe-inspiring, sublime, as romantic poets might describe a volcano, tsunami, or other force of nature. Indeed, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is the day that the world changed. And as new ages summon new prophets, they also summon new literatures. It's a given that artistic form and the epistemology and ontology of a time are mutually reinforcing as well as generative. Indeed, formal changes are the reason the arts have a history at all, or as literary historian Franco Moretti concluded after using software to analyze thousands of novels, for every genre comes a moment when its inner form can no longer represent the most significant aspects of contemporary reality and is superseded by forms that do. Often, the catalyst for transformation is the technology or science of an age, as when Galileo helped move the Earth from the center of the cosmos, as Darwin did by ushering humankind from the center of the garden, and the digital and genetic advances that gave us Dolly the sheep and our global electronic ecology make individual borders ever more diffuse. And this is my real subject today, the new literature that media theorist Joe Tabbi's over summons. Specifically, I consider his major books and see in them a manifesto developed across 30 years or a way for the novel to remain relevant in this post-Noachian technical age. But what I've found equally compelling is an offhand remark Joe made to me some 30 years ago. I've always wanted to be a media theorist who writes in longhand. Joe, I'm sure, doesn't remember his offhand remark that he made, but to me it was very significant. And I use that evocative utterance as the subtitle of part one of what will be my three-part reading today, which begins with Tabbi's deepest level of inquiry, cognitive fictions. In it, Tabbi draws a parallel between what science reveals about cognition and how select novels reflect the lessons of cognitive science. In the background of this inquiry is the question, why, if science doesn't support the assumptions that our sense of self and world comes from the mind's continual construction, revision, and reconstruction of the narrative we call our lives, why is the preference for conventional character-based narrative, a form of 19th century realism, still so prevalent? Can a reconsideration of the novel through the lessons of cognitive science renew narrative, especially the print novel, marginalized as it is by new technologies of narrative? It's instructive to consider the conventional understanding of the mind's functioning and the concomitant character-based narrative that was dominant at the time of Tabbi's first book, and still is today. Its poster child, of course, is Freudian psychology, with its emphasis on psychosexual development via the interplay of the consciousness and unconscious mind, the anxiety inherent in the resulting tension, and the mitigation of this anxiety by various defense mechanisms that bury the real psychological reasons for one's behavior. Mental events or consciousness itself often replaces action as the basis for plot. For example, the subject of a modernist novel is less about what happens as what someone thought had happened, while criticism, as Tabbi notes, often reads these texts using techniques of psychoanalysis. Symbol hunting, to put it less charitably. Though Freud was seminal in our understanding of mental states, we now understand him less as a scientist and more as a poet, describing the anxieties of his age. As Tabbi lays out in his cognitive fictions, the theory of mind one finds emerging out of contemporary sciences of the mind is much more empirical than Freudian psychology, and has produced detailed descriptions of modules of brain and distributed neural networks in us. Examples that come to mind include V.S. Ramachandran's research with phantom limb pain, in which a person who lost a leg still feels the pain in the missing leg as if it's still there. By substituting a mirror image of the intact leg in place of the missing leg, therapy on the intact leg can teach the patient's brain to feel relief in the missing leg. That is, cognition as a function of brain is distributed. It involves not only the brain, but also external materials and relationships. Cognition, perception, memory, motivation, etc., is understood more as an emergent phenomena arising from clusters of modules of brain activity down to the level of the cell, and can often be mimicked through computer simulations. Indeed, it's useful to note that the large language models used in AI have similarities to the way neuroscientists believe the brain operates, using a semantic hub to integrate information from differing modalities. Distinct subsystems connected to eyes and ears, for example, that operate too fast for consciousness to register, which the hub receives from modality-specific spokes, a process that is no more available to consciousness than the neurological pulses that allow me to speak these words. In machine learning, Tabbi writes, the more layers of processing that a neural network has between input and output, with 3 being considered deep learning, the more opaque its operations will be, a characteristic that will also have consequences for the novel, as we'll later see. With this theory of mind as a starting point, Tabbi asks us to consider literature not as a representation of reality, but as a means of registering experiences that emerge from a largely mediated environment, even if we are unaware of the processes that create the experiences. Hence, he writes, many of the questions I ask of literary texts will be the same questions contemporary cognitive scientists find themselves asking. For example, how do cooperation, seriality, sequentiality, and focality of consciousness actually come about within a distributed system? Or how can we identify consciousness? These are all questions that ultimately have to do with the knowability of one's subject by human subjects whose cognition is much broader than consciousness. Yet, as Tabbi notes, consciousness famously evades one's grasp the moment one attempts to observe it in oneself. The metaphor of the light bulb in the refrigerator comes to mind. Is the light always on, or only when I open the door? Does opening the door, so to speak, activate consciousness, or only my attention to it? The flicker between the answers implied by cognitive science, the subjective ephemeral quality, as Tabbi calls it, is a recurrent theme in novels that reflect on their own methods of noting phenomenal experience. That literature's subjective power is also, like consciousness, inextricably caught up with its ephemeral nature, and it has profound implications for how we value the act of writing in an era of multiplicity. Indeed, he argues that the fictive presentation of cognitive operation is our time's literary defamiliarizations par excellence. In trying to bring the full range of cultural noise and mediation to literary consciousness, such works ultimately imply more significance, more context, and more connectivity than any single mind could ever hold in experience or present on page. This distancing and distributing of consciousness may feel familiar to us, for as Tabbi writes, it is not confined to literature. Every day, with each use of a credit card, we are telling the man more about ourselves than we know, as a character in Pynchon's Vineland says. Or as critic Lyndon Brigham wrote to him in email, Amazon.com gives me all kinds of suggestions about what to buy because it, more than I, know what I have bought there and has, in its database way, given thought to the matter. Like the influence of the machine that Tabbi felt moving from a typewriter to Word 5.0, like Ramachandran's experiments with mirror therapy, the database is the phantom limb we feel aching even if we can't see or touch it. Still, we can try. Anyone's cell phone could have been used to make an animation such as the one made by a Green Party candidate in Germany who hacked into his own phone to access the trove of location data that it sent back to his phone company. In detail, it maps out his movements over a 6-month period, revealing, for example, where he was, how long he stayed at each location, whether he traveled by car, train, or on foot, when he made or received a call or text and from whom, and many other details of life that could be extrapolated from the simple pings all phones need to communicate. See, for example, one drone's eye view of massive protesters who have turned on the flashlight feature of their phone as a form of political protest in Hong Kong. Commenting on the thousands of phones visible to the drone, investigators point out that each one also emanates an invisible beacon of location and identification data that others can eavesdrop on, and that we give away for the convenience of being able to locate ourselves on a map, order a pizza, book an Uber, check the weather, or use any of the thousands of apps that require this signal. A signal that keeps broadcasting long after the protesters turn off their camera lights, head to their homes, and take off their masks. Yet as powerful as location data may be, it is only one type of information harvested about each person. Clearview AI is one company that banks digital diagrams of the millions of faces that can be found online. The websites we visit install trackers on our computers, phones, and other devices that generate metrics about their users, which is gathered by data brokers such as Axiom LLC, just one of a dizzying array of corporations that compile this information, offering fine-grained profiles of some 2.5 billion individuals, as the company's promotional material proudly explains. When combined at an industrial scale with databases of digital fingerprints, it's possible to identify and track the residents of a whole city or whole country. Without any special training, it only took a few minutes for reporters from the New York Times to single out and identify, for example, celebrities and their overnight guests, protesters at Trump's inauguration, the police who arrested them, Secret Service agents assigned to protect Trump, as well as ordinary people just going about their day, such as Dr. Richard Madonna, a professor of optometry picked out at random and identified by reporters using $60 worth of Amazon's facial recognition software as he passed by a public weather camera. All of this we know, of course. Email is often said to be a euphemism for everyone's mail. That is mail anyone can read. We realize that our phone company knows more about our movements than we do, and maybe more about us than our spouses. For as one judge noted, simply knowing where someone travels would allow others to deduce whether he was a weekly churchgoer, a heavy drinker, a regular at the gym, an unfaithful husband, an outpatient receiving medical treatment, an associate of particular individuals or political groups, and not just one such fact, but all such facts. While we might be surprised to learn the obscene extent to which we are tracked, as one reporter put it after telling the hundreds of entities that installed tracking software on his computer over the course of a single day, like him, we do not give up our internet connections or ATM cards. We don't stop using websites to book hotels or order tickets. Just the opposite. We ourselves engage in deeper levels of this behavior, bringing into existence Googling as a verb, using apps that create pointless selfies, so to speak, of sleep patterns, pastry consumption, dog walks, location, alertness, productivity, the number of steps we take in a day, how fast our heart beats, what those around us in a restaurant are ordering, and dozens of other metrics. Unlike the Uber citizens of Orwell's dystopia, and this is the most telling point, the vast majority of this personal information about us has been made available by us voluntarily, or at least indifferently. We assume we are tracked even as we track our pets, our luggage, our children. Sorry. I have to take this. Hello? What? Now? Are you kidding? Right now? Sorry. My corporate sponsor just reminded me that I'm supposed to show a commercial about that tracking software I was talking about.
Amazon Recognition is a fully managed computer vision service that helps you move past manual inspection by automating your image and video analysis with highly scalable deep learning technology. And the best part is, you don't need any machine learning experience to use it. With Amazon Recognition, you get highly accurate facial analysis and matching, as well as object, scene, segment, and text detection that you can use to find specific content in large numbers of images and videos. Using facial analysis, you can identify and verify users, such as customers, students, and sellers, by matching their faces with their identity document pictures.
Isn't that just great? The degree to which my depiction of surveillance culture is familiar, even quotidian, is one indicator of the degree to which the humanist sense of the individual, made possible by the concepts of separation and privacy, is becoming obsolete. We may not have reached the point expressed by Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg that privacy is no longer a social norm, that is, no longer expected or even wanted, but the view of computer scientist Arvind Narayana seems accurate. According to him, the amount of data that each of us generates just by living, the incentives to mine this data, and the increasing power and decreasing cost of the tools used to do so have already brought us to the point where anonymity of any kind may be algorithmically impossible. As Tabbi puts it, what were once local experiences in everything from shopping to human relationships have been expanded by the database, a distributed memory that is less part of our consciousness than something larger than the individual, something that is everywhere and nowhere, a hyper-object like capitalism that knows more about us and influences our very actions, and cognitive fictions, as Tabbi terms those fictions that reflect this state of distributed cognition. Cognitive fictions do trace a kind of book death, but only in the humanist sense of the novel, as conventional humanist assumptions are undermined by new technologies, replaced by the hive mind and social formations that they engender, as well as the social, cultural systems we are perceived and we use to perceive and construct reality. Except for Thomas Pynchon and Richard Powers, the authors that Tabbi parses for signs of writing under the sign of our digital phantom limb, they don't address this theme thematically, but that does not prevent these authors from registering the effects of what it feels like to live in a world where consciousness itself is increasingly distributed and so threatens to escape the experiential constraints that were once taken for granted. They do so not by expanding into the new media and so losing their distinctive qualities, nor by retreating into the reflexive maze of mind thinking about itself thinking. Instead, they refashion themselves to answer the challenge of new media through what Richard Gruson and David Bolter called remediation. Beyond the mere repurposing of one older medium within another, like a movie version of a novel, remediation is a process of reconceptualizing an older media in the context of the new, or in the case of the novel, the context of a new media landscape and a more distributed sense of cognition and material. Think here how photography was once proclaimed to be the death of painting, or movies were predicted to be the death of theater. Instead, once freed of its documentational role, painting became more painterly, theater became more theatric. Likewise, new media might compel the print novel to be more printerly. This is one of the ways I understand a media critic who writes in longhand. Those of you who are old enough to remember phone books and paper maps or dictionaries will understand how the print that remains after the Gutenberg parentheses will be more printerly, a medium more suited than the digital, as Tabbi writes, for sustained memory and long-term subjective interactivity. For example, I remember being in a rare book room and holding a sheet of music, a clear example of the kind of printerly notation Tabbi refers to. The music was composed by Schumann or some other famous person, but that wasn't important. What mattered was how clearly the rhythm with which the creator wrote seemed to materialize and be present in the room. The first notes were jet black on the page, and then as the hand continued to write, those notes gradually grew fainter until suddenly they got strong again, because that was the point at which whoever was writing had obviously dipped the quill he or she was using into the inkwell to recharge it. And so it went, line after line, all the way down the page, strong black notes followed by notes that grew progressively fainter until the pen was dipped and the cycle begun anew with a jet black note. If I half closed my eyes, the lines looked like that spectrum of gray that art students used to practice, over and over, rhythmically, like music itself, like waves at the beach, or rather waves in time and motion, the contemplative rhythm of somebody engaged in the close work of writing, or rather copying. The pattern was too uniform to be composing, and it conjured a whole way of life that has vanished. A world where being literate meant learning how to trim the nib of a feather and shape it to create different fonts, a square blunt end for Gothic, or tapered with just the right amount of springiness to write in italic. They would have carried a penknife to sharpen the quill when it dulled, and there would have been shops to buy them in. But of course, all those shops are now ghosts too. I need to adjust my assumptions about the real when communicating with someone who came of age in a different discourse network, Tabbi wrote. Even as a letter sent to a friend without email forces me out of one system with its expectations about response time, attentiveness, the likelihood of the message being saved, etc., and into another, older system. Likewise, the potential for entering into a relationship changes when phones acquire caller ID, and I no longer risk interrupting another person, but instead expose myself to that person's scrutiny. The caller ID of telephones redistributes romantic power, in other words. But I wish I could time travel back to tell the Joe Tabbi of 1996, man, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till you get to the age of the algorithm. Swipe left. Translation. I've always wanted to be a media theorist who wrote with a telegraph key. Following Zizek, Tabbi would describe the distributed reality summarized above as a material reality that in reality is wholly simulated. Zizek, a hyperobject or sublime object that is neither wholly mind nor wholly body, but an immaterial corporeality. A city, as Tabbi notes, that is no longer walkable, and so no more available to the flaneur than the realism of a Balzac, Dickens, Dreiser, or Dos Passos. It is, however, available to the digital flaneur or flanus, the doom scrollers, the web crawlers, the trolls, the influencers and their followers, the large language models that both read and generate these digital landscapes. Indeed, Tabbi writes, one could hardly find a more contemporary occasion for the sublime than the excessive production of technology itself. Its crisscrossing networks of computers, transportation systems, and communication media, successors to the omnipotent nature of 19th century romanticism, have come to represent a magnitude that at once attracts and repels the imagination, the postmodern sublime. Since Tabbi coined that phrase, our world has become even more sublime in its interconnectedness, virtual reality, decentralization, absence centers, dissolving categories, heterogeneity, gene blurring and genetic mixing, surveillance and meta-awareness at a scale that far exceeds the postmodern. The global is literally local, not just metaphorically so, and the evidence can be seen in phenomena as diverse as global warming or hospital operations held for ransom by hackers an ocean away. Ever more frequently, Tabbi writes, architects and engineers are coming to rely on computer simulations to reconstruct the sensual experiences that is felt increasingly to be passing from ordinary life. And when the body is denied an integral place in the ordinary life world, it has a tendency itself to become the scene of writing and self-expression. Indeed, though I've focused on the phantom limb of distribution and databases, the postmodern sublime Tabbi describes could also be tracked through bodies, from a time when biology was synonymous with destiny to today, a time when people no longer need go through life with the nose or chemistry they were born with, but assume that their bodies, even their DNA, can be edited, patented, and rearranged, while progress in bioengineering, especially engineered animals, 3D printed body parts, pharmaceuticals, and industrially grown biomaterials are rapidly bringing body modifications to entire populations. And of course, all of this border crossing is being accelerated by AI. It need not be pointed out how rapidly AI is erasing both material and metaphoric borders in every aspect, but especially in terms of channels of communication and relations between humans. As AI becomes a more significant part of our culture, it's becoming harder to not be a participant in the grand experiment in simulated reality or immaterial corporeality that we are all living. We use AI in ways that are as seemingly innocuous as letting it complete our sentences to those that foretell a dark future. In simulated dogfights, for example, American fighter pilots are regularly wiped out by AI-piloted jets. Quotidian life now includes the fact that all viral posts on social media contain AI-generated comments and reposts. Many of the people seen on social media sites such as Instagram are AI-generated models. Google searches return AI images and articles while marketers flood the internet with AI-generated reviews. Even mainstream periodicals publish AI-generated articles under the byline of AI-generated authors and use AI-generated voice actors to read their audio articles. So pervasive are AI-generated or altered realities that they range from the nude photos high school students make of their classmates by using declothing apps to illustrations in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Indeed, AI-generated content is becoming so ubiquitous that the companies that make these tools are concerned that their models could implode since they continually use this sea of fakes, simulations, and misinformation to learn the content upon which future results will be based. My point in this expansion of what Tabbi termed early on as the postmodern sublime is to underscore how the dominant social formations and material facts of day-to-day existence have contributed to a sense of self and a sense of that self's place in society that, as Tabbi notes, is different from the modern sense of self, or the medieval or the classical, we might add. As Gerald Bruns writes, the human has always been a literary concept, a discursive formation like the divine. And today, societal pressures that have come to the fore to imagine the human as, in the words of N. Catherine Hales, an amalgam, a collection of heterogeneous components, a material informational entity whose boundaries undergo continuous construction and reconstruction. Not only is it becoming increasingly difficult to keep our sense of privacy from merging into corridors of others, it is increasingly difficult to say where I begin and you end, materially as well as socially, as the last pandemic highlighted. Or as Tabbi puts it, when we contemplate technology, we're ultimately contemplating ourselves, for the expressive potential within the machine returns us to the source of all thought, the human mind in relation to other minds. We may not be able to comprehend the abstract network of contemporary technological forces as writers in the tradition of 19th century naturalist fiction believe they could represent and extrapolate from the forces contained in more visible steam, steel, and coal technologies. But this representational insufficiency does not prevent us from reflecting imaginatively. Indeed, the ramifications for how we read and write are as profound as the emergence of privacy led to Shakespeare's invention of the soliloquy. So I asked ChatGPT about this post-human business, and he, she, or it told me that while the literary arts and periods from the Renaissance into the present could be seen as one humanist longue durée with features in one period waxing or waning in the others, when differences in degree become so marked as to be differences in kind, a watershed emerges, as for example between modernism and postmodernism. And in similar fashion, differences between the last 500 years of humanism and the present, or in material terms, the period from Gutenberg to the internet, are giving rise to differences in kind that can be called posthumanism, a paradigm shift from the sense of self as a being with a unique and private mind and life to a sense of self that is more widely distributed, shared, invisible. Thus, unlike authors who during modernism tried to model inner consciousness, for example, some artists and authors today experiment with moving conceptually outward to model experience from a position where the individual is neither the center of creation nor unique and exceptional, where the narrative engine is more likely to be a concept of emergence rather than cause and effect, and whose characters embody a post-human ontology of permeable borders, distributed cognition, and non-human agency in place of the unique individual singularity and exceptionalism of humans in the humanist novel, whose narration admits as co-author the technological and scientific forces that bring it into existence. In this regard, Tabbi is careful to distinguish post-human from transhuman. That is, rather than using the term post-human to signify an extension of human powers, i.e. the cyborgs of science fiction that often reify the most traditional humanist values, his use of the term signifies a dramatic departure from humanist and enlightened traditions that have dominated over the past 500 years. Posthumanism is not just another period, though. Indeed, Tabbi believes that the idea of periods is passé. He points to literatures of the past that have affinities with contemporary new materialist writing, Arachne turning into a spider, for example, or Daphne transforming into a laurel tree, or all the other instances of the porous nature between humans and non-human beings in Ovid. Other literary antecedents of posthumanism would include Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, William Wordsworth's World is Too Much With Us, and many others. The convergence of literature and cognition that Tabbi notes, though, is a reason he sees for the shift towards a more cognitive realism in fiction based on notation and reportability rather than representation, and recognizing conscious experience as a process of selection, an autopoietic creation out of noise that is far more complex than anything yet accomplished by computer simulation. In brief, Tabbi writes, one feature of a literary posthumanism is its ability to reconceive other than human narratives without projecting godlike qualities onto either individual subjects or collective machinations. A literature that gives us less domesticity, fewer filled-out characters, and more world. Art historian Erwin Parnowski describes how forms that cut across the particular idiosyncrasies of individual artists can embody an overall epistemology. His example was the genre of three-point perspective painting, a form of visual representation that organized the world spatially rather than by the religious hierarchy used by medieval artists. And if we look, as Tabbi does, across the idiosyncrasies of individual writers and artists, we get a sense of some of the ways a post-human aesthetic might be emerging. Though the forms, paths, and goals differ, an aesthetic can be seen in which isolated individuals are subsumed by groups, or the uniqueness of an individual, as in a psychological portrait, is replaced by notation and reportability, where pattern forms the ground of being, and or the material world is given agency. Artist Jason Sullivan describes his work as a hybrid of cultural sampling and data mining, in which, for example, he averages the pixels of 10 years of nude centerfolds to create his every Playboy centerfold. Eric Whiteacre assembles choirs of thousands of singers by collapsing time and space between them. Eduardo Cac's Plantimal, a plant-animal hybrid, is a flower created in a lab as a work of art that carries both plant and human DNA, a fusion of Eduardo's own DNA with that of a petunia, giving the flower its eponymous name, Edunia. Also using technology to raise issues of identity, privacy, and boundaries, or lack of them, artist Heather Dewey Hagborg walks around New York City picking up bits of hair, chewing gum, cigarette butts, and other litter that she finds in places like the subway. She then extracts the DNA left on these things and from it creates 3D portraits of the people they came from. While on the surface, the output of her practice resembles traditional portrait busts, the real subjects, like those of Sullivan and Cac, is obviously not representations of people, but the database of genes and the technologies that allow the depictions of people to be made. Likewise, in literary fiction, there is an emerging awareness that Stendhal's metaphor of the novel as a mirror on the road of life may be less relevant to telling the story of today than a narrative that is at home with larger than human scale and the agency of non-human actors. That does not mourn the loss of the first-person narrative, but privileges the virtual over being present, big data patterns over individual details, that incorporates randomness or chaos as parts of life and privileges probability over mechanistic cause and effect, that takes as a given the fact that the body, the last firewall to the individual, is in the end as permeable as all barriers between the I, culture, and society. Claire Louise Bennett's novel Pond blurs the lines between self and object with candles, rugs, bookcases, and other things serving as non-human actors. Her detailed presentations of objects like almonds as fingernails are some of the clearest examples in contemporary fiction of an object-oriented literary practice, Tabbi writes. Though widely recognized as the first great novel of the 21st century, Roberto Bolaño's 2666 provoked frustration in reviewers who tried to describe the subject in traditional plot or character-centric terms. The difficulty is not the novel's heterogeneity of form, one wrote. The problem is that there's no single central something about which the novel attempts to speak. The subject of Bolaño's novel, however, is precisely its attempt to speak about a lack of a center, or a hidden center as Bolaño referred to it, the vast solar system of intangible structures that underlie society and has its influence in determining the conduct of individuals and societies as a whole. It may be that 2666 is the round peg that cannot fit the square hole of traditional humanist literature, but it maps closely onto the model of social network as narrative. A multitude of characters are introduced, only to disappear completely, turn into dead ends, or become faint traces in the web of connections that Bolaño implies bring into existence larger patterns. As this novel hopscotches across decades and continents, none of the crimes it revolves around are solved. Indeed, little is revealed other than a sense of what it is to be alive today, when a desire for inexpensive appliances in America or Europe can create social circumstances that make poor women easy prey in Mexico. A time when people are both individuals and aggregates. As Sarah Kerr wrote, describing what she called this post-nationalist novel, if 2666 contains a lesson, it is that people are always from a confluence of factors. It is, in other words, a novel where pattern forms the ground of being, though with our individual worm's eye view of life, this too is normally invisible to us. In his novel Measuring the World, Daniel Kellman imagines the naturalist Alexander von Humboldt telling the mathematician Johann Gauss that he had heard that Gauss was now concentrating on probability theory. Death statistics, replied Gauss. One thought one controlled one's own existence, he continued. One created things, discovered things, acquired goods, found people one loved more than one's life, had children, maybe clever, maybe clods, watched a person one loved die, got old, got ill, then got buried. One thought one had decided it all oneself. Only mathematics demonstrated that one had always taken the common path. Near the end of his life, Gauss has discovered the long view, we might say, the data narrative. Gauss could tell his story of patterns through the form of the humanist novel, maybe as a Bildungsroman or of one of his children, or really from the viewpoint of any of us here, the human scale. Or he could tell their story from the long view, the view we have from a rising airplane, or the viewpoint of data, as Hales calls it. As we move from the viewpoint in the humanist novel to that of data, what is lost is the narrative of the individual viewpoint. What takes its place is pattern and shape, the material traces of a city, the grid city streets, the squares of field, the law of averages or immaterial corporeality of wholly simulated realities. The mere image of a phantom limb, the invisible database that is co-author to my selection of a spouse or the next book I read. Pull out even further, and even these traces of collective action evaporate, even human time, or as we might call it, plot. Tabbi reminds us that constructing a narrative always determines what will be seen, and so what is. Our narrative architectures are no more neutral than was Galileo's telescope, and we might, as Joseph Tabbi writes, welcome a post-human perspective, not as an extension of our own individual agencies and cognitive capacity, but as a revitalization of our imaginative engagements with elements that are only partially known. Thank you.